Sister Nivedita. And Sister Nivedita was one of Swami Vivekanand's foremost disciples. She also contributed to the Indian independence movement, and she also galvanized a lot of Indian women towards, fighting the British. And also she was a very, very spiritually minded lady, very spiritually minded person who did a lot, a very great contribution from her part. Another point is that Swami Vivekanand, as you also spoke about it, but just to elaborate more, the newspapers of that time, they were absolutely amazed at Swamiji's personality. And actually there are some other newspapers which were not mentioned over here, but I've read about it before, that they were amazed how Swamiji could speak so much without a scrap of paper, because he didn't plan anything. When you give a speech, normally people jot down some notes, or they prepare the entire speech, they practice and so on, right? But in the case of Swamiji, it was all impromptu. He didn't need to plan anything. It was right there in his mind, and he had absolute clarity on what he had to convey. So the newspapers were completely amazed at such a personality. Another very important point, also not covered by the video. Of course, the video has its limitations in terms of the size and the length. They cannot keep on making it so long. But Swamiji came at a very unique time in history, because what had happened was that when the British ruled India, initially when they brought their scholars with them, many of these scholars were extremely impressed with Indian knowledge. They were completely astounded at what the Vedas and what the Upanishads mentioned. If you remember, historically, the British came to India around the 18th century. At that time, you had the French Renaissance, which took place in Europe. And that was a period in which, before that, the church was dictating every single thing. So if the Bible says the earth is flat, and if you disbelieve it, then you go to prison or you're banished, right? However, when the French Renaissance took place in Europe, at that time, a lot of people with scientific knowledge and so on, they came forward and their voices began to be heard. And they started to reject religion, because their understanding of religion was what they read in the Bible or the Quran. So when when the British came to India in the 18th century, they were completely amazed at what the Vedas and what the Upanishads mentioned, because it was so scientific and so much knowledge was inside there. So for at least 40 or 50 years, the scholars, they began to translate the works from Sanskrit to English, Sanskrit to German, and so many languages, right? So for 30, 40 years, there was a period in which Indian knowledge began to be spread in different languages. But later, when the Christian missionaries came, they got shocked at the kind of respect that the Indian books were getting. And their main intention was to convert India into Christianity. They did not want that Hinduism's voice should be heard across the world. So as a result, they began to demean Hindu culture. They began to spread wrong information about India, that in India they burn brides, in India they kill people, they worship demons. So this kind of misinformation began to spread across the world. So when Swamiji went to the States in 1890s, at that moment of time, the people in the US had a very, very negative image about India. They thought India is a country of darkness, which is extremely poor, but not just extremely poor, but also absolutely ignorant in any kind of religion or knowledge. And that's why it's the duty of all Christians to spread the message of Christianity to India and make India a Christian nation. That's why when the video was being shown, there was a clipping from a newspaper which was being read that it is foolish for us to send our missionaries to India. Do you remember hearing that in the newspaper extract that was shown in the video? You can go back and hear it again. So when Swamiji came to the States, people were having a negative impression about India. But by Swamiji's personality and his knowledge, he was able to impress so many people of very high intellectual knowledge, scientists, philosophers, academics, right? They were completely impressed by the kind of knowledge that Swamiji possessed. At that moment of time, many scientists had become atheistic because they felt that the Bible was very unscientific. But when they heard what Swamiji was saying, and the knowledge of Vedas and Upanishads are so scientific, they became very impressed with what Swamiji was saying. So Swamiji was able to change in a significant way the kind of negative image that India was carrying, thanks to the Christian missionaries that the British, were there at that time. So that was one of Swamiji's greatest contributions, making a transformation in India's image. Of course, that does not mean that after Swamiji, everything changed for the good. No, the negative impression still continued for quite some time. But he was the one which began the process of transformation. So that makes a very big difference. Another point is when he went back to India, remember in those days, the British government had a policy, dual policy. First of all, they were trying to convert, not directly, but through their Christian missionaries, people into Christianity, right? And the second thing was that they were trying to, there was a person in, a British person called as Lord Macaulay. And he told in the British Parliament or British leaders that the only way to rule over India is if we are able to establish a class of Indians who are just Indian in name. Okay, they are Indian by face, they are Indian in their skin, but in terms of their mentality, they should be the same like British people. So they should be thinking like British. They should speak English. They should follow all kinds of British mannerisms. Only in their faces and names they will be Indian. So these kind of people can act as a bridge between the British, that is us, and the people who are not studying in English schools. So these people who went to, so the Indians who went to British schools, they learned that Hinduism is a very bad religion. India is a very bad country. And it's only thanks to the British that Indians have started to get culture. So that's what they learned in those British schools. So they developed a lot of inferiority complex. So when Swami Vivekananda came in the picture, at that time, the Indians who went to schools, including those who were Swamiji's friends when he was a kid, his name was Narendranath. You already heard that, right? So when he was a kid, at that time, many of his friends also had a lot of inferiority complex towards Hinduism. Why? Because the schools they went to taught all kinds of negative things about India. So Swamiji is going to the States, coming back to India, and seeing that the Indian people saw that Swamiji had received so much of respect and so much of adulation, so much of the reception was so impressive in the States and in the Western countries. So those Indians who had so much inferiority complex towards Hinduism, they began to realize that, wow, this is something really unique, because we thought that we are among the worst countries in terms of knowledge, and we are being given education and culture only by the British and by the Americans. But now the things have changed. The American scientists and professors are saying that Swami Vivekananda is a unique personality, and the message he's preaching about Hinduism is the most scientific and the best in the world. So the moral of the Indians completely changed when Swami Vivekananda went back to India, because he went with a success, right? He came back successful, not as a failure. So that made a very big impact on Indians of all generations. And that's the reason why last week I also disclosed about it, that all our revolutionaries and freedom fighters, right from Mahatma Gandhi to Babasaheb Ambedkar, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, Aurobindo Ghosh, to industrialists like J.R.D. Tata, and everybody was so impressed by Swami Vivekananda. Mahatma Gandhi mentioned that by reading Swami Vivekananda's works, his patriotism increased 1,000 times. Babasaheb Ambedkar, who is considered as the father of India's constitution, he said that the greatest Indian ever produced was Gautam Buddha. But the greatest Indian produced in the last 2 centuries was definitely Swami Vivekananda. And Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose considered Swamiji as his guru. And this is just giving you a small example. There are lots and lots of examples. So even people like, there's a famous novelist called as J.D. Salinger, who wrote a famous book called as The Catcher in the Rye, considered as among the greatest books ever published. He also was extremely impressed by Swami Vivekananda. Swamiji also met with Albert Einstein, who also was quite impressed by Swami Vivekananda. So the point I'm going to make over here is that Swamiji was a very unique personality. And that's the reason why, even though India has produced so many saints, but during the colonial period, one person who really stood out was Swami Vivekanand, and that's why we celebrate his birth anniversary along with Makar Sankranti